All right, so I think Stephanie's on her way into the room if she's not already here in the virtual room. And then once she gets here, we'll let her unmute her mic. So what I'll start with first is an introduction of myself. So my name's Dolly Singh. I have been a team builder for a long time and I've worked in tech for 15 plus years. I love the tech industry, and obviously as a woman of color, these are two passion points for me, and the discussions that we're starting to have this year, while difficult and trying and exhausting, I'm actually really, really thankful for, and really thankful for all of you guys today, so we can continue the dialogue and the conversation. So I'd love for each of you guys to introduce yourselves. Tammy, why don't you go first, and then I'll jump to Elise after that.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I am Tammy Smithers, Dr. Tammy Smithers, and I am a scholar activist. I mean, that's what I am. I essentially have a degree in ethical leadership with an emphasis in social justice. And that led me to the work that I am doing today. I am actually teaching a course in the fall that I'm extremely excited about called Diversity, Equity, and Leadership. And so additional work for me is that I'm a visiting scholar with the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice at Rutgers University. And I also have co-founded and am co-managing partner of a Impact Global Leadership and Diversity boutique consultancy. So I've been to work. I also came from the corporate world. So I spent a number of years working in financial services for a number of high profile corporations, on one being on Wall Street. And so I do have that background that I bring with me. And so merging that with the corporate and the academic has been interesting, especially in the current day time that we're in. And so I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. Elise, how about you next?
Hi guys, happy to be here as well. My name is Elise Stone. I am a celebrity commissioned visual artist. I've worked on commissions for Lionel Richie and Jose Feliciano. And I'm also a product design engineer. I'm currently working at Belkin. I'm also a former startup founder. So my visual art background, I'm really interested in how history informs the present. And so that informs the current conversation today.
Awesome. Thank you, Elise. Miss Dominique, I'm going to jump to you. I think you're on mute. Oh, Dom's having audio issues. Okay, let's do Stephanie. Let me jump to you, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie LeBlanc. I am the head of inclusion programs for women of color at Google. I also advise on a number of startup and have been dipping my toe into angel investing. And then on the side of that side, also do a lot of just speaking engagements talking about women in color in corporate America. And also founded a parenting community called Parenting Backwards. So having conversations with parents about how to raise do conscious and intentional parenting to raise kids in this crazy world.
Yes, I'll have probably lots. You could send me all your books because I've got a house full of teenagers. So
I got you.
A very real challenge. Thank you, Stephanie. All right, let's try Dominique. Does your audio work? 3, 2. Okay, maybe not yet. So Dominique, when you pop back in, drop me a line in the chat and I would love to have you introduce yourself. So let me jump into like a discussion topic that's very top of mind for me, and all of you guys have direct experience and I feel like can help be wise sages to guide me through this process. So one of my real challenges is, when you're a woman of color, one, diversity and inclusion is something that matters to you. But now part of my job is to help be a D&I advocate for our internal communities. And I think there's this very tight balance that you have to walk between telling your white peers the truth, kind of the unfiltered truth, and not having them feel defensive or not having them feel like the conversation then
Hi,
becomes,
Dolly, can you hear me?
hey, Dom, yes, I'm gonna,
Hi.
you wanna do
Sure.
an intro now real quick?
Yes, so my apologies. I was on mute. I had to press *6. So sorry for everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Really quickly, I'm Dominique Hollins. Would love to not have my camera hidden, but having technical difficulties. I'm the founder and CEO of We360, which is really just looking at a comprehensive view of how diversity, equity, and inclusion should be integrated throughout the fabric of the entire organization, from HR throughout the business and through employee accountability, from board of directors all the way down to individual contributors, and I create comprehensive customized packages. My background prior to that is not in HR. I actually have 10 years of both financial services and tech experience, which gives me an operational foundation to speak to this from a business standpoint versus HR. I'm excited to be here with you all and learn from everyone on the call today. Thank you.
Okay, awesome, Dee. Thank you so much. So to give everybody some background, I met Dominique at Grace Hopper. She was my moderator for a talk I was fortunate enough to give there, and just was a remarkable, her energy, her presence. I was super impressed, and so really, really appreciative to have you here today, Dom. So one of the questions that I was starting to pose to the group is, how are you guys finding your ability to walk the balance between telling the unfiltered truth, that I think now is the moment to tell those unfiltered truths, but doing so in a way that it's productive, and allows everybody on the receiving end to not feel defensive. And I understand that, today's generation of our white peers didn't directly do anything themselves, right? So how do we help them take accountability without feeling necessarily guilty for the generations that came before them? So I think this is just a tough conversation and a tough topic. And for me, as a woman of color and as a person who's supposed to be helping lead our D&I function, it's just been a really tough balance to strike. So I'd love to go around. Maybe Tammy, if you want to kick us off.
Well, I think there's a couple of things there, and I know that the more recent generation of working, individuals, the young generation, I guess it's millennials, Gen Z, didn't have anything to really do with that. But I think they are benefiting from, perhaps if they are of the dominant culture, they are benefiting from some level of privilege. So I think that's where the conversation has to start. If they're looking at individuals like themselves, where they are, or maybe how they got their job, or whatever that looks like, that's sort of where you can begin. I think we are in a state of, I won't say emergency, but we do have to have conversations, very hard conversations. And I personally, I guess I'm not necessarily in the space that many of you are in terms of having to sanitize my language when it comes to this, because quite frankly, this has been going on for a while, and I think we're just at that boiling point. So how do you have that conversation and make it be more productive in a workplace is sort of probably what I want to speak to. And there are different ways to approach this. And I was just reading something on yesterday, and I'm going to give you kind of the academic, just give you some scholarly conversation around this. But there are, in the Harvard Review, there's two professors. One is James Dietert, and the other is Laura Morgan, and they've written a piece around this, how to have this productive conversation. And they bring up 5 points, and I'll just kind of read them here for the group. And they basically talk about using allies and speak as a collective. So essentially, we've heard this term allies, right? To sort of have the conversation many times, because you are a person on the person of color, or a Black or brown person, you may come with this with a little bit more passion that may not necessarily be received well. And so I think their stance is, bringing in someone else to sort of speak with you as a collective. The second point that they make is about channeling your emotions, but don't suppress them. It's okay to show that passion. And I am extremely passionate when it comes to this issue. And so that would be something that I would, not necessarily say suppress, but express. and get the point across. The third that they bring into play is this anticipate others' negative reaction. You know, we know that we've had these conversations, people become, I guess, accusatory. They even accuse you of being racial or racially divisive. And so, you know, that's something that we have to be prepared for, but also be ready to sort of have a counter for that. The fourth tip that they give is framing what you say so that it's compelling to your counterpart. And I want to give the example of what we've seen with corporate executives. You know, typically when people are speaking out about, you know, their injustices, they may be on a different type of level. But what was different this time around with the current environment was a lot of corporate executives were speaking out, right? They were sharing their stories. And on social media, you saw a lot of the hashtag campaigns with even academics or people in medical school or who had gone to medical school sharing their own personal stories. So I think that is where those compelling stories that are out there make people pay attention. And the fifth is just the follow-up around, you know, all of these conversations, you know, the work that needs to be done. I think that's sort of the follow-up that needs to happen as you're talking about this, because, you know, this is something that's not a 3-6 month conversation. This is going to be a conversation that we're going to have within organizations for many, you know, months and years to come. So I think that's sort of a good starting guide that I wanted to share in terms of how you begin that conversation.
That's amazing. Thank you. That's very actionable. I think we're starting some of those pieces, right? Really learning to amplify the allies that we know are not resistors and trying to kind of like let the resistors out themselves a bit. So absolutely. Thank you so much. That was such great advice. Elise, you want to give me your input? I know that one of the things you've done recently is start, you know, kicking off an affinity or an ERG group within your organization. And you really took it upon yourself as a Black woman within the engineer organization to help speak on behalf of the community, which is a burden that not everybody wants right now, frankly, right? Not everybody wants their white peers asking them, help me solve this problem. That's just another burden that's then being placed on your lap. But I know that you carried that burden and you have made some great progress. So what are your insights and what's your input?
Yeah, for me, it's three things anecdotally. So first, it's education. Second, I think it's saying no. And then the third, I think it's setting boundaries. So education, presenting all the information, right? Like, I think a lot of times people are well-intentioned, but I think that on a national level, we're having just a massive re-education just across the board. On a social level, in corporate America, understanding the different forms of systemic oppression, understanding the history of everything, and then also understanding, you know, like the value in having diverse talent sitting at the table. So education was a huge part of the work that I did, and laying that out. And then, you know, I think just saying no, like, no, that's not appropriate, right? Or no, it shouldn't be this way, it should be this way. I think no is simple and it's very powerful. And then also setting boundaries, right? Like knowing when is it time to take a break or when is it time to, you know, just say, that's not what I'm going to do right now. So that's what I've done.
You're on mute.
Yeah.
That's great because my doorbell just rung and so you guys didn't have to hear that. So Steph, let me ask your input. Google, I think, clearly an industry leader, right, has the potential and the power to set a great standard for the rest of the tech industry. Does that create like an additional burden for you, right? Where one, you're not only trying to guide and represent for an underprivileged community that is a minority within this behemoth, but then people look to that behemoth at large for leadership. So give me your perspective on how you're navigating that internally, and then maybe even how Google's perspective as a brand is on some of these issues.
Sure. So I think this time around where police brutality is being televised is different from every other year that this kind of comes up, in that we're finally calling a thing a thing. We're finally saying white privilege. We're finally saying anti-racism, right? We're using all of these terms that we were aware of, but now our leaders are saying it, and not using soft language or whitewash language to talk about it. We're not all the way there yet. They're saying words, they're giving money, but there's no accountability. The accountability piece is the missing, because you could send tens of millions of dollars, right? Which is still a drop in the bucket for all of these large companies. But then shouldn't you follow the trail of that money to make sure that it's actually doing the things that you're saying that you want it to have an impact on? And so within this space and internally, I feel this sense of we now have the right to question everything. It's no longer commonplace or normal to be like, all right, we're just going to do this because it's what we've been doing. We're no longer going to engage with a company just because it's what we've been doing. We have this sort of just entitlement to question everything, and for the white people in the room to be like, okay, whatever you say will kind of go that way. And so myself and many of us are taking advantage of that, right? Like we finally are getting not only a seat at the table, but our voice heard very quickly. And so instead of the tax of sharing our stories, giving them and telling them what we should be doing and have been doing this for quite some time, they're now actually taking action on it. And I have to say that I think that COVID has helped that. And here's why, right? COVID came, everyone was in each other's house through Zoom calls. They saw the parents, the kids, the mess, all of these things. There was all this empathy. We're in this together. We're struggling through this, right? We're sharing stories and being vulnerable with each other. And then Ahmaud Arbery happened. Those conversations all of a sudden weren't really happening. We were just talking about my dog and what it's eating. And now this huge, incredible thing that now has touched us to our core has happened. And that's not a topic that we feel comfortable bringing up, right? So I think that as this shift to talking about race first within companies, we now have something like, you do have empathy, you do know how to use those muscles, so they need to be applied here. And we have the proof of that. And so that's how we kind of gauge those conversations. The same way we created an emergency team for COVID and how we're going to support our employees is the same way that we need to create an emergency team and figure out how we're going to address the inequities, what's happening in the world that is impacting our employees as well.
You know, I agree with you 100%. I've reframed my perspective on 2020. At first I was like, this is like the worst shitstorm anybody, like I hated it. And I was and I still am slightly disgruntled, but now I kind of think it's like the purge, right? Where it's like all the toxins are like forced to the surface. Yep. And you got to reconcile with them, because I think it was the combination of the silence of the world during COVID and the combination of the cruelty with which George Floyd was killed. Undeniable, right? Every second of that almost 9 minutes is fucking excruciating. If you are human, somewhere inside of you, you know that that is not okay. There is no gray zone, right? So I think, you know, all of these things, as painful as they are, I really do hope that this time is different. And if you look at, you know, I know sports is just trying to like make some semblance of a comeback, but it was Colin Kaepernick by himself being ostracized. And now it is entire franchises across every major sport. So that is, you know, remarkable progress. So I am trying my best to lead with optimism in these times. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. Dominique, I'm sure you have a bunch of thoughts and input. So give me your thoughts on, especially as an external consultant now, I feel like that's actually a more powerful position to be in than the internal head of D&I, because I've got to walk a tightrope whereas you can just say what needs to be said. So give me your perspective on how you're taking this power. She might be frozen. Oh, sorry, Dom. She'll come back. So let me jump back to Tammy. I actually had a question for you that's more.
Can you hear me now, Dolly?
You got it? Yes. Okay, great. So
Yeah.
give me your thoughts and input.
One, I do feel like I have a significant amount of freedom because I'm an external DEI practitioner. In fact, when I was quoted in the Washington Post and they reached out to me, they said, I need you to give input because the other people I spoke to are afraid to lose their job. So I literally, like, I have people secretly call me so I can go and say whatever I want because I've been waiting for this for a long time. I echo the sentiments of what the panel has shared today. And what I will add to that is this sense of urgency has already been here. I am no longer waiting for people to adjust to it. I am looking to power and I'm looking at the legislation and the policies. I am no longer looking at the programs and the panels. I want to know, what are we doing to fundamentally shift this so that the infrastructure and the institutions that we're leading no longer perpetuate this? So I'm not asking for permission. I'm looking at your code of ethics. I want to know what your legal team is doing to set you up and also what your employees have access to. So when they do have a discrimination case that you are now not covering HR, you're covering your employees. So I'm taking this time to really dig in to do the things I expect of a CEO, I expect of a VP of engineering, I expect of you as someone who claims to be an intellectual. I'm acknowledging your IQ, and now I am encouraging you to explore that you have an EQ deficit. This is an EQ problem, and we keep trying to approach it with an IQ system, and it isn't working. The other part of this is I don't want these leaders to, I want everybody to know change only happens when discomfort is present. These leaders are now uncomfortable. If you're an ally and you're an advocate and you're uncomfortable, great, because unfortunately you've been comfortable for too long. And now we need that discomfort in order to push for action. So this is a very momentous time. I am saddened by the loss that COVID has created. And at the same time, we so desperately needed it as a nation, as corporate America, as a world, for us to really self-assess and then to disrupt and innovate in a way we never have before. So now I'm holding everybody accountable. I don't expect anything less, and I'm going to treat them like the executives they purport to be.
I don't even know if I have nothing to say to that one. I love that, right? Because I can't bring that heat because I'm going to get called in the principal's office and be like,
right.
you need to tone it down. You need to take a few seats. That's really, I think that's remarkable, right? And at least there is, for the first time, the appetite to be like, let's bring in perspectives from outside that might be willing to make us uncomfortable in this moment. So I think even that, I have to give, although I can focus on the shortcomings of my white colleagues, I have to give them credit. Many of them I have seen step up to the plate in ways that are above and beyond what I anticipated, and certainly being willing to be vulnerable and raw and open, and at the very least acknowledge that this is a journey they need to begin in some way, shape, or form. So I think, I am, again, generally pretty optimistic. One of the things that dampens my optimism, though, and Tammy, I'm going to kick this to you. This is a generational problem, right? There have been 400 years of deficit, right? And I think it's the Kimberly Patrice Jones analogy of 400 rounds of Monopoly, where we got no bills. And now all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, now you should just go. And there is no just go, right? Until there is some sort of, I know reparations is a scary word for a lot of people, but you have to repair things if you damage them. So I don't know why reparations is such a scary word, but if you break something, you should fix it. That's kind of like very simple. And so if we spent 400 years breaking down a community, do we not have the responsibility to then look at the investment needed in that community, not as a moment, not even as a movement, but as a long-term societal priority? And I think the problem with that is, even if we all say that in this moment, the problem is our governmental institutions turn over every 2 to 4 years. So how do we solve a generational problem in a society where the powers that be turn over every 2 to 4 years, right? So Tammy, I'll start with you, and then I'd love to get everybody else's input.
Right. Well, I mean, when you look at, we do have people that, come in and out every 2 to 4 years, but there are other people who have been there. And I typically think when you think about, I would say organizationally, individuals who have been there, the leadership, when the leadership changes, the individuals who are still doing the work may not change. So if there is a system of in place, I think that the goal, continues, right? I can't, I can't get back 400 years, but what you can give me is the opportunity, right? You can give me the seat at the table. You can give me policies that don't prohibit me from, doing what I need to do to advance, right? You can give me investment, right? Don't make it harder for me as a business person to take out, a loan for my business when you give someone else in the same predicament that the money with ease. And so these are, some of the structures when you think about, the banking systems, you think about the political systems, you think about our schools from an accessibility and just equity perspective. Education is supposed to be accessible to everyone, and it's not the same. And so those are all of these other problems that are sort of, within our overall system. When we talk about systemic racism, we're talking about these big structures, right? These big structures that are in place that have sort of held a group of people back for, as your point, many years. And so I think that's where we start. But at the same time, I want to kind of piggyback off of something that was said, and I probably started this conversation about allyship, right? When we talk about allyship, we talk about people, kind of stepping in and out of something. We need other people who are actually in this with us as a person of color, as a Black person. We need, white people to help to actually dismantle the racism that's there. And so we need them to be accomplices with us in the fight, in the struggle, and know when to sort of, step out when, needed. But ultimately, we need kind of everybody working together, on both sides to kind of help with the advancement and, giving the group of people what they, ultimately are requesting, or, I wouldn't even say owed. Well, we're owed that, but ultimately just getting the equity piece there. So I would kick it to the next person, but that's sort of my take on just, how all of this sort of works together.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else have any input on how we solve such a long range challenge?
I have input. I think it's also important for us to also look at our history, right? So yes, all these negative things did happen. And Dolly, I agree with you. And I also agree with Tammy. I think it's also important to remember and pay attention to, there's also been all these positive stories of Black Americans who have overcome just immeasurable odds, dating all the way back to a very, very, very long time ago, and have achieved success. And then that success was taken away. For instance, Mary Ellen Pleasant, one of the first Black female millionaires, San Francisco. She had a 30-bedroom mansion, prominent, was an investor, did all these things, and then her mansion was burned down, right? She even owned property in Napa. So when we talk about, the foundation of Silicon Valley where innovation happens, there was a Black woman who was there doing things. So I think there's a lot of stories like that. And I think that's also very important in the larger conversation as well.
Totally agree. I think telling the stories of people that overcome those obstacles, absolutely critical. But sometimes I think it achieves the slightly opposite result, right? Barack Obama being elected president made people feel like, oh, this is not a problem anymore, right? So I don't know where the balance is. And I agree, you can't constantly only tell downside stories, because that like adds to your own self-perception, right? So telling the stories of people who win while making sure that we point out the reality that this is winning in a circumstance where we still have to run 10 times as fast, 10 times as far, bringing attention to that. And how do you do that, again, without damaging this? Like my husband is Black. My sons are, 3 young Black men. And I worry deeply about what the psychological impact of constantly seeing what is basically snuff films of people that look like them on loop on these viral videos constantly. Yes, I think it's very important that these stories be told, but like what impact is that having on them, right? So, but yeah, absolutely agree with you. Very, very valid point. Stephanie,
One
Dominique,
quick comment, Dolly.
you guys?
For the same, yeah, for the same point, the comment was about how do you maintain our momentum given these intergenerational changes, and the generation before has to work with the generation after, and vice versa. Right now, we just lost John Lewis, one of the most historic civil rights leaders of our time, and I have so many of my friends and family freaking out, and they're like, "What do we do?" And I said, do what he did. The baton is ours now. There is no waiting for anybody else. The time is ours. And so the only reason I can appreciate that, I immediately called my grandmother and asked her, Grandma, how do you feel about what happened? Because she grew up in Selma, Alabama. And she said, you all have to keep going. She said, what you're going through today is nowhere near as difficult as what we went through. So we gave you all what you needed to have the momentum to take the knowledge of today and carry it forward. But if those intergenerational conversations are not happening, then we're losing the historical knowledge, which means we are bound to repeat the same mistakes. It's like being on a hamster wheel. So what I would implore everyone in this conversation is whatever your practice is for work, talk to your family about it, talk to your children, get their perspective, start to engage them in the conversation, because if they don't have the context for why you're doing what you're doing, then when you're no longer here, they will have to learn from the beginning, and now we have delayed that progress. So this is another form of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Ageism is very real. There are men right now getting like Botox because they want to look younger because they know discrimination is coming. So with that, why don't we make ageism not a thing and appreciate the value of what you learned in the newer generation and take the history and the lessons learned from the former generation so we can accelerate together more effectively. And I think that continuity needs to be built in how we all communicate as individuals, as communities, and as organizations.
Thank you, Dom. I love it. Stephanie, any input from you on kind of the long range challenge of these issues and how you're approaching it?
Yeah, I think education is the biggest piece. So this week, I'm in quote unquote summer school with the African American Policy Forum focused on critical race theory and intersectionality. And I'm in day 2, and it's just blowing my mind on knowing how deep these issues are and how deep racism goes and how every system and thing that we touch is entrenched in it. But like listening to the experts, like explain how we rely on the law, right, to get rights to do a thing, but rights is a social construct that is steeped in racism. So there's this double helix of like needing the law to lean on to say that we have rights as a human, but the fact that the law and the Supreme Court was designed, and it still does, oppress people of color, particularly Black people. And so with that, I think my focus is on education, right? Because in what I'm learning now is shaping differently how I need to show up and the way in which conversations are had about solving these challenges, and really dismantling everything that we thought was normal, right? So this is, to your point, the long game, and things that is not going to happen in a week, a month, by the end of 2020, but we need to get the education so that we know the things that we're purporting or pushing forward that just need to be completely burned down and start and rebuilt in a new way.
Totally agree with you. I actually have some perspective on how I think tech and corporate America can kind of fill that gap, because like institutions are actually longer enduring than how our governmental structures change over, right? And we now have platforms, right, that have larger communities than nation states. And all of us across tech have started in the last 3 to 5 years building out like our employee resource groups or affinity groups or whatever you want to call them. And as I've sort of come to think about this over the last 6 months, I think what it reminds me of is the same power that unions have. What unions do is they give you collective voice and collective bargaining power, essentially, right? And that works great in a blue collar environment. I think what ERGs are basically micro unions inside of tech and corporate. And there's certainly some power in each of those groups, but the greater the extent to which we can aggregate power across these groups. So if our ERG groups across companies are talking, we have an ability to kind of establish, what we think should be standards, right? What are the goals and targets that our expectations have? Because I think the real power that we have as diverse talent, right? I think talent is the most valuable commodity in the world. And I think everybody on this call and all the amazing people in my network are highly employable anywhere. So I think we have an ability, to your point, Stephanie, of holding the feet to the fire of our leadership and of our corporate institutions in a way that we might not even be able to do with our government, right? We can say, we will only give you our talents if you hold to the standards that we have collectively acknowledged as appropriate. Now, how we begin those conversations and how we get to that place to where we even know or agree on what those standards are, I think, is a long ways off. But I do think that's the greater the extent to which we can aggregate power, especially across the people of color in corporate and tech America today, because if you combine our earning power, if you combine our labor force, if you combine the contributions that we make to the ecosystem that is America, you can't live or survive without those contributions. And no company, if every person of color or woman was to say, you know what, you failed to meet our standards, we are going to resign en masse, nobody would survive that. There is not a business that could survive that. So I really think we have more power now than we've ever had. And the question is, what do we want? You know what I mean? And how do we build the roadmap to getting it? So any thoughts and perspective from any of you guys on that?
I can take that. I think in a product, so I'm a product design engineer. And so in a product perspective and in an engineering perspective, I think what I hear a lot is that there's a pipeline problem, right? They're like, where's the talent? And I don't think that's the case at all, as most of us on this call probably know that already. But I think what is missing in this conversation is not just giving people a seat at the table. Like, it's not enough to give people the job, right? Like, you need to actually create systems and support where people can actually lead, Black people. And I think a lot of times that's missing. And so I think that has to be worked into this larger conversation as we talk about that.
Agreed. I think that's primarily where I've seen where even the best intentioned corporate institutions, companies fall short. You have leadership up to a certain level, but then when you look at the C-suite, that's where real change needs to happen. And it's where we still aren't seeing, like, it's in the halls of real power that we are sometimes the most excluded. So absolutely agree with that. Anybody else?
My thoughts are just that if we're not looking at this problem comprehensively, then they're not committed to actually making change. And one of the things I advocate for is policy, process, and programs. Most of these companies, in an effort to show that they are in support of this work, is they start with a program, right? They want something flashy, especially the tech industry. Let's put it at a conference and let's take all of our underrepresented employees and send them to that conference so we can give the facade that we actually are diverse. And then they get the talent, and the talent comes in and they're tricked because the company hasn't worked on retention or development or growth, and they don't have any leadership. So until your company or your organization or even you as a leader are talking about this in a comprehensive in a comprehensive manner, then you're not really committed to solving the problem. Our executive leaders love athlete references. Well, you can be a football player overnight. You can't be a basketball player overnight. It starts with certain training, and then you work on certain skills, and then you got to pivot, and then you do it comprehensively. Why is that our corporations seem to be really comfortable with diversifying a portfolio, and yet they can't diversify their workforce, which is the largest asset that they have? This is a decision. So unless they're talking about the 5 core components of HR, which I would say is talent and acquisition, learning and development, benefits, legal, and employer experience, if they're not talking together about DEI, then it's probably happening incorrectly, because the employee life cycle is one continuum for an individual, and we're not getting the tools that we need. What I'm seeing is a lot of check the box action, and I need employees to now start calling that out, that I don't just want unconscious bias. I want to know when we're going to infuse that in our compliance training every year. I want to know how your leaders not just your executives, but the people managers and everybody throughout the organization, what is the 5 to 10% of their performance that's going to be dedicated to cultural reform? What is the obligation for everyone at the organization from board of directors down to below? But if you're only looking at your employee resource groups, not only have you missed the problem, you have exacerbated it by overwhelming the one group or the several groups that have the least amount of power in the organization. So if it's not a comprehensive approach, they do not actually want reform, and find an organization that does.
Yes, I'm with you. I mean, but your comments bring up, like, I think an inherent conflict. Yes, all of that is true if you are genuinely and authentically committed, right? If you still see it as a distraction to your primary business purpose, right? So getting leaders to a point where they see diversity and inclusion is in and of itself an asset to your top and bottom line. Whereas I think, especially, I think this is to your point, actually, Dominique, about IQ versus EQ. Tech organizations in particular, like very IQ driven, right? So very focused on data and analytics, very focused on the top and bottom line, and very focused on where you can be like, I can draw a dotted line from this investment to this ROI. Whereas EQ issues are tougher to quantify, tougher to measure, and really require consistent long-term kind of longitudinal investment. So how are you like sussing out what is the level of true commitment? And because that's the difference between actions that are going to be meaningful for communities that are impacted versus I need to check the box in order to make sure that my PR slate is clean. So give me your perspective on how you're creating that accountability to real change versus, kind of tokenized change.
Yeah, I'll touch base on this. So I think particularly within tech companies, right? We're driven by the data, and wherever the data goes, whatever it says, we either cut a product or go all in. And somehow when data comes in about the human experiences, it's like they short circuit. They want more data, or they want the anecdotes to go along with the data. We give them the stories through focus groups, surveys, all of these things. And they're like, okay, that's great, these stories, but maybe they're just isolated instances. We need the data. And so it's just this vicious cycle of like needing to find this like smoking gun of like, this actually isn't a thing. And we spend a lot of time focusing on that and chasing this story instead of just doing the work that really needs to be done. And so that accountability piece is the topic at the moment, the conversation at the moment. Individual contributors are the heart of the company and are the ones that are part of the ERGs and pushing for change and doing these changes. Then we have the leaders who are, speaking the words of saying that this is what we stand for, these are our values. And what's missing is that focus on middle management. How are they being trained? How are they being held accountable? Their leaders are saying something, but they're not seeing the action from their leaders. So basically, you're saying it's important, but I'm not seeing how it's important. And the only way that we can get there is to incentivize through money, right? Money drives all of us to do a thing, right? So if there is something that says that if you don't do X, Y, and Z, this performance cycle, then you'll get docked a perf score, or it will impact your just overall bonus, right? That's when people will start to think and get creative and do a thing. Now that could unearth a whole other set of issues, but I think that's the connection that needs to happen, where if you're not held accountable in some tangible way, then unless you're proximate to the situation, then you're not connected enough to see the value in doing a thing. You hear the stories and it's so sad. You're so hurt by it, but then it's not in your sphere to keep it top of mind until you run into that Black person again, or until it makes the news again. And we need that consistent, in your face reminders and actions to take place in order for that change to happen. And we haven't gotten there. The conversations at this moment in terms of the experience that I'm having again is, oh wow, this is a thing, right? Like we're at like not even 101, we're at like zero point 0.5 of the class of like, oh, there really is a problem, right? Like it's finally sinking in. And so we're trying to meet them where they are and like take them on this journey to be like, all right, hurry up now. Like we got things to do. We have, systemic changes that need to take place. We have traumatized folks in this company right now that we need to address and take care of, instead of donating $10 million here or donating money here or saying that now you're going to change your hiring policies and bring in more folks into this company that is severely damaged in its current state. And so as like a D&I person, like that's where we have to kind of like push our leadership focus to not these quick wins to say that we did this thing, but like it's the long game. You need to be transparent with your team, with your company, let them know what you're working on, consistent check-ins, and not just be caught up in this moment of saying a thing. And then 6 months down the line, everyone, well, they have all forgotten about it, while we're still kind of all left holding the bag and feeling the impact of, goals and promises not being met.
I mean, I think you brought up a really, really key point there with the middle management layer, right? Because a lot of times, especially in high growth, high performance organizations, you promote people very, very quickly, but you don't necessarily take the time to invest in teaching them how to go from good IQ individual contributors to effective EQ leaders. And in that delta is what, what a lot is lost in translation. So I think focusing on direct people leaders as much as you focus on your leadership team. And once you can get some level of alignment with your leadership team, if the people that are managing every human aren't also then taking and internalizing that stated culture or those stated goals, you're going to really have a hard time making real progress. So 100% agree with you on that. So to Dominique's point a few minutes ago, we had the passing of John Lewis, a civil rights leader and icon. And he was known for the phrase good trouble, right? Which to some of the topics today, right? Like the law is a very poor guideline for what is or isn't right, because the law is created by humans basically to benefit mostly people in positions of power a lot of times. But what is right and what's wrong, I think most of us inside usually do have a good barometer on. And he kind of always used that internal compass to guide him. And I'd love to pose to the panel, what's some good trouble that you are hoping to make in the next year, given that this is a moment and an opportunity and kind of a defining time that we have the opportunity to participate in, and the way that the generation before us made an impact. This is our opportunity and our time, I think, as Dominique called us out. So Tammy, I'll start with you and give me your perspective on what's some good trouble.
Yeah. So, and I want to acknowledge another civil rights icon who also passed away, and that's C.T. Vivian. He was a part of that as well. But I was very intentional in starting this year in making sure that I got active in politically, right? Active in terms of getting people registered to vote. So that's one of the things that I'm doing all in, actually on a national level with another organization that we've partnered with, created a grassroots organization in my home city. And essentially we're partnering with Michelle Obama's organization on a national level to get 2,000 people registered to vote between now and before the primaries. The second thing is the census, right? Getting people to fill out that census. I think those are very action-oriented things that I wanted to connect with this year, because quite frankly, that's our population is growing, and we got to make sure that everybody is accounted for and that the services are available. And so those are the two actionable things that were immediate that I wanted to get involved with for this year, in addition to the other work that I'm doing on a scholarly level, and just kind of advancing the needle in that perspective. So that's my personal goal, personal passion around voter activation, mobilization, as well as ensuring that every citizen of this country has a voice, right, on a full spectrum. So that's my commitment, and that's what I'm currently in the work doing at this moment.
Well, thank you for that work. I mean, we could do a segment just on voter suppression and the amount of creativity that's used to suppress the votes of Black and brown people in this country, and the extent to which, like, if you go back through history, how many elections could have been changed or flipped if there weren't these kind of dirty tactics at play. And so we have to work twice as hard to make sure even our votes don't count as much, because the system is literally set up to help steal votes away from us, right? So thank you for that work that you're doing. And let me know if there's anything I can do to be helpful.
Absolutely.
All right, Elise, let me jump to you. I know you and I definitely tried to get in some good trouble in not too long ago, which is another story for another day. But give me your perspective on how you're going to help, carry on the legacy of John Lewis.
Yeah, I'll give a quick take on what Dolly is hinting at. So Dolly and I went and did a live art activism project. And what came out of that for me is I think we really have to normalize using our voice and normalizing what activism looks like, right? And activism isn't just posting something on social media. It's not just, for Black people and people of color have been having these conversations for a very long time, but it's normalizing taking bold action, because bold action today is what's going to be required to actually create change. So for that project we did, it was commenting that the racial violence that we're seeing today, racial violence by the police and racial violence by the community, is actually a form of modern day lynching, right? And that's a taboo thing, but it shouldn't be, because if we look at the overall history of our country, like that's what's happening. And so taking bold action around that, saying that, no, that's not okay, and normalizing that. So I think we have to do that at every single facet of our society and completely tear apart the entire system.
Yeah, and I want to just piggyback on that point. I think language is weaponized against Black and brown people in very subversive ways, right? You see headlines where if it's a storm and it's, white people that are, looting from a facility, it's that they're trying to survive, they're trying to save their kids. If it's Black people, it's like these criminals are looting. So I think language is very much used very differently across different demographics in this country. So calling out that lynching is lynching, even in the case of like the current administration. Nobody wants to tell Donald Trump he's a liar, but everybody will say he has 12,000 myths, truths per day. Like, this makes no sense. But yes, thank you for that. So Stephanie, what about you? What kind of good trouble are you getting into?
Sure. So Brittany Packett Cunningham has this shirt that says persist and resist. And that's been my sort of motto in this space, to persist on asking the questions, on pushing back, on asking why, on calling out, and not trying to make anyone feel comfortable in the fact of just telling the truth, and letting that be my guide. And then just the resistance part of of looking at the resistance and being part of it, and also just on the education front, talking to my kids about it, being really vocal so that they understand. So I'm taking them on the journey that I'm going on about learning about critical race theory and intersectionality, and how the world that we live in is created, so that they are walking with that knowledge and with that power to do differently, to show up differently in spaces, and not being accepting of everything that comes their way, and that they're able to speak confidently about things that they see and that aren't right. So smashing those stereotypes of like, just be kind, be nice, it's a stranger, even though your spidey senses are going off, be nice. Like dismantling all that. If it don't feel right, go the other way. If it feels wrong, say something and push back against it, so that we're not just continuing this another generation forward.
Amazing. Absolutely. And as a, fellow mom trying to raise the next generation, I can relate to you 100%. I'm trying to teach them to know their strength and power, but it's scary and it's hard. Honestly, I don't want to teach my boys to go out there and pretend to be powerful with authority figures. I want them
Right.
to be quiet because I don't want to put them at risk. So it's this weird balance of, yes, I want them to be empowered, but I don't want them to be in danger because of their voices. So I don't know the right answer. You know what I mean? And maybe we'll take that offline, mom to mom. So Dominique, what about you? Tell me about your good trouble.
So I just made this up, but I think it fits. I'm going to have an Oreo approach to this, and I have been. I work with leadership at the top as the institution builders and upholders. I work with them directly to acknowledge the fault and the missed opportunity in maintaining an oppressive and non-productive workforce. So I'm working at the top, using their language to get them to change their mind. Sometimes benefits work, but sometimes the risk of a loss is a lot more powerful. And so I've learned to use that language to affect change at the top. Now, at the bottom, these are the people whose proximity to oppression is unbearable. And I'm looking to give them the tools to protect themselves while we bridge the gap in the middle, which is the cream to the Oreo. And everything in between is the goodness when you pull it together. But until you have the people on the front lines prepared to deal with the headwinds, until we get them the progress they deserve, we need the people at the top to understand the harm that their institutions are creating, and you have to have them eradicated. And everybody in the middle should be upheld to a standard that should be maintained and tracked. What I say is that our country right now is undergoing psychological trauma that's beyond even what we experienced in the 1930s, even what we experienced in Vietnam War from the losses. There is no moment of history as bad as this one. The difference for people of color and underrepresented minorities is that we've always had to deal with chaos. The difference is now the world is dealing with chaos. So we actually have an advantage because we know what it's like to constantly not have to deal with the bare minimum. This is actually our time. But if we do not manage it well, we will find ourselves in the same position, and we need to get leaders to be held accountable where every quarter you should have an all hands with 5 things on a performance scorecard: hiring, recruiting, promotion, development, and leadership. If it's green, they're on the right track. But I assure you, for most of your organizations, it's red. If you're not talking about that every quarter and watching that performance scorecard change, they are not serious about it. We're not going to affect change. That's where I'm going to start. I think you all can push for that too. So thank you for the question.
Absolutely. And so I'll close this out. So my version of good trouble, I've been kind of a loudmouth my whole life. So I'm going to keep on doing that. I'm going to look to elevate the voices of amazing other women around me, like all of you guys who are here today. Thank you guys so much for your input, your insights, your transparency. This is a very genuine journey for me because I want to do what's right for my kids and help create the world that we want for them. But I'm also a capitalist, right? Like I want to win, and I want to make sure that we help our business leaders understand that this is a part of winning. And this is how we can win in ways that we haven't even imagined and unlock opportunities that we have not even begun to think about, right? I genuinely think that innovation and inclusion are very closely linked concepts. At SpaceX, everybody, agrees Elon is arguably one of the most innovative and groundbreaking leaders in the world. And really what he does is build teams that are very hyper diverse. Right? He calls it cognitive diversity, but if you code for cognitive diversity and industrial diversity, you tend to build more diversity than you do otherwise, because your whole goal is to take people that are not homogenous, right? Make people that are very different, put them in one room. They have to all be equally brilliant, right? So there's no lowering the bar. You keep everybody super smart, but you want them to kind of have very different inputs. Otherwise, you recreate the same thing over and over, right? That evolutionary change is possible from homogeneous teams, but revolutionary change is only possible from heterogeneous teams that can challenge one another. So I'm going to keep doing the, small pieces that I can do. Thank you guys for all the great work that you're doing in the world. And I will look for ways for us to continue to collaborate and kind of aggregate our power. I think that's where we have real opportunity in the years ahead. So thank you guys so much. I'm going to let you go because we're officially 3 minutes over. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Dolly. Bye.